At 2047 in the morning, 3 black SUVs rolled into our cul-de-sac and shut off their headlights, but left their engines running, filling the cold Ohio air with diesel smoke. Men wearing tactical vests walked across my lawn with flashlights, leaned toward my windows, and took pictures of the rooms where my wife and daughter were sleeping. All of that happened because I asked one question at an HOA meeting: where did our money go? My name is Grant Mercer, and before all this started, I honestly believed the worst thing that could happen in a quiet suburban neighborhood was somebody leaving their trash cans out too long. I had spent 22 years in the Air Force maintaining rescue helicopters, most of the kind that flew into places everyone else was trying to escape. And when I retired, I wanted a life so boring it would have embarrassed my younger self. My wife, Claire, worked nights as an emergency room nurse. Our 16-year-old daughter, Hannah, played varsity softball and volunteered at the local animal shelter. And I spent most afternoons in my garage repairing lawnmowers, old motorcycles, and anything else my neighbors dragged over with an apologetic smile. I never charged anyone, unless you count coffee, beer, or the occasional plate of ribs, and for 4 years nobody complained. Cedar Hollow felt like the kind of place people move to when they are tired of drama. 200 modest homes, maple trees lining the sidewalks, kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on, neighbors borrowing tools and forgetting to return them for 6 months. Then Marlene Voss moved in. Marlene was the kind of woman who could make saying good morning sound like a legal warning. She wore cream-colored suits, drove a pearl-white Mercedes, and had a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had made her money selling luxury homes. Or at least that was what she told everyone. And within 8 months, she had become president of the Cedar Hollow Property Association. Her campaign slogan was, "Preserve standards, protect values," which sounded reasonable until you realized her definition of standards included measuring hedge height with a metal ruler and photographing children's bicycles like they were abandoned vehicles at a crime scene. The first people she targeted were the ones least likely to fight back. Mrs. Alder, a 79-year-old widow 2 houses down from us, got fined because her lavender bushes were not symmetrical. A young couple named Luis and Megan received 3 violations in 1 month because their twins left chalk drawings on the sidewalk. My neighbor Cal, who had parked the same plumbing van in his driveway since the neighborhood was built, was suddenly told commercial vehicles damaged the residential character of the community. At first, we laughed about it in my garage, because when rules become ridiculous, humor is often the last cheap form of resistance. Cal held up his violation letter one afternoon and said, "Apparently my Ford Transit is destroying civilization." I told him, "You should apologize to democracy." We laughed, but not for long, because the fines kept growing, and Marlene had a talent for making people feel isolated, as though each violation was a private shame nobody else would understand. Then the monthly HOA fee jumped from $165 to $325, effective immediately. No vote, no budget meeting. No explanation beyond a glossy letter claiming enhanced landscaping, upgraded security, and long-term infrastructure planning required decisive financial action. Most people complained quietly and paid. That is how fear usually starts in places like Cedar Hollow. Not with sirens or threats, but with people deciding it is easier to write a check than ask a question. I was not trying to start a revolution when I went to the next meeting. I was wearing jeans, work boots, and a sweatshirt with a grease stain on the sleeve, and I had planned to speak for maybe 30 seconds. The community room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while Marlene sat at the front table beside 4 board members who looked like they had been instructed not to blink without permission. When public comments opened, I stood and said, "I would like to see the financial breakdown supporting the fee increase, including vendor contracts and reserve account balances." The room went quiet in that heavy way. Silence gets when everyone is thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to be the first to admit it. Marlene folded her hands, tilted her head, and gave me that polished smile. Mr. Pot frowns. "Mercer, certain vendor information is confidential due to competitive bidding." I had spent 2 decades dealing with government contracts, maintenance budgets, and procurement officers who could hide a mistake inside 600 pages of paperwork. So, I knew nonsense when I heard it. "These are homeowner funds," I said, "not classified aircraft parts. Members have a right to inspect the records," or Smile tightened. The board will review your request and respond through the appropriate channels. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived accusing me of operating an unauthorized mechanical business from my residence. The fine was $250 per day until all commercial activity ceased. Claire read it at the kitchen counter after a 12-hour hospital shift, still wearing navy scrubs. Her hair pulled back and exhaustion shadowing her eyes. She looked at the letter, then at me, and said, "This has nothing to do with your garage." Hannah stopped doing homework at the table. "Can they take the house?" she asked. That question hit me harder than the fine. I told her no, not if we handled it correctly. But I could see fear settling into her face, and I hated Marlene for bringing that fear into my home. The strange part was that Marlene's own brother, Dean, stored commercial landscaping trailers, riding mowers, fertilizer tanks, and 3 employee trucks at his house in the upscale section of Cedar Hollow. His company, Voss Grounds Management, had recently received the HOA landscaping contract, but apparently business activity only became dangerous when it happened in my garage for free. I responded to the violation in writing, requested a hearing, and repeated my demand for financial records. 48 hours later, the patrol started. The vehicles belonged to Sentinel Neighborhood Services, a security company that had appeared almost overnight, complete with black SUVs, tactical uniforms, and badges designed to look official from a distance. They parked outside my house, photographed neighbors who visited me, and followed Claire when she drove to the hospital. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but on the 3rd night she called me from the employee parking garage, her voice low and controlled. "Grant, the same SUV followed me all the way from home. It is parked across from the entrance." I drove there and found it idling beneath a broken parking light. 2 men inside pretending not to watch me. I took pictures of the plate, and they pulled away slowly, like they wanted me to know they could leave whenever they chose. A week later, Anna came home from the school bus stop pale and angry. "One of those security guys took pictures of me," she said. "He didn't even try to hide it." That was the moment something changed inside me. Until then, I had treated Marlene like a corrupt administrator abusing paperwork, but photographing my daughter turned this into something else. Still, anger is useful only if you keep it on a leash. And military life had taught me that the person who loses discipline usually loses the fight. So I did not confront the guards, threaten Marlene, or make a scene. I installed cameras, documented every vehicle, recorded every patrol, and began building a timeline. Then I drove downtown to the county records office and asked for every public filing connected to Marlene Voss, her brother, Sentinel Neighborhood Services, and every vendor paid by Cedar Hollow in the last 2 years. The clerk, an older man named Norman with thick glasses and a tie covered in tiny sailboats, looked at the stack of forms and said, "You planning to buy the neighborhood?" I told him, "No, sir. Just trying to figure out who already did." 6 hours later, sitting beneath flickering basement lights with dust on my hands, I found the first number that made my stomach tighten. Voss Grounds Management had billed Cedar Hollow $792,000 in 18 months, nearly $4,000 per household, for work that looked suspiciously like weekly mowing, cheap flowers, and fresh mulch whenever Marlene wanted the neighborhood to smell expensive. Sentinel had collected another $148,000 for security assessments and community patrols, but the real problem was hidden in the invoices. Emergency irrigation repairs on Thanksgiving Day, storm cleanup during weeks with no storms, premium drought-resistant plants that I recognized as $12 annuals from the garden center near the highway. The same flower beds were being replaced every month and billed at full installation cost each time. I sat there staring at the paperwork, listening to the hum of the lights, and felt that old familiar sensation from my service days. The moment when a minor maintenance irregularity suddenly reveals a system-wide failure. Marlene had not doubled our fees to protect Cedar Hollow. She had doubled them because someone had built a machine that converted fear into money, and I was beginning to understand exactly how it worked. I went home with copies of every invoice I could legally obtain, spread them across the kitchen table, and started building a timeline while Claire made coffee strong enough to dissolve a wrench. The numbers were ugly, but the pattern was worse. Money came in through increased HOA dues, then moved almost immediately into emergency vendor payments that required no competitive bidding, most of them going to companies tied to Marlene, her brother Dean, or people who had donated to her board campaign. There were duplicate charges hidden under different descriptions. soil conditioning and organic root treatment billed on the same afternoon, storm debris removal during a week with clear skies. Security inspections charged on Street Sentinel had never visited. Claire leaned over one invoice, traced a line with her finger, and said, "They billed $800 for medical-grade pest control around the clubhouse." I looked at her. "Is medical-grade pest control a thing?" She gave me the expression nurses reserve for people who try to explain how the internet cured their chest pain. No, Grant, but fraud-grade nonsense apparently is. We laughed for maybe 5 seconds. Then the weight of it settled back over us. These were not abstract numbers. Every dollar Marlene siphoned away belonged to someone like Mrs. Alder, who counted grocery money at the end of each month, or Luis and Megan, who worked opposite shifts so one of them could always be home with the twins. I filed a formal complaint with the state's Community Association Division, requested an emergency audit, and sent another certified demand for the complete financial records. Then I created a private online group called Cedar Hollow Ledger, where neighbors could upload violation letters, photographs, and payment histories. Within 48 hours, 53 households joined, and what had looked like scattered harassment turned into a map of deliberate retaliation. People who had attended my garage gatherings received more violations than anyone else. Residents who supported Marlene received warnings instead of fines. Dean's landscaping equipment blocked sidewalks for hours without consequence, while Cal's plumbing van was treated like a toxic waste shipment. The stories kept coming, and some of them were hard to read. One retired teacher had paid nearly $6,000 in fines because her porch railing was the wrong shade of gray. A widower had received a lien mourning over $200 in late fees that began while he was hospitalized. A single mother had stopped letting her son play basketball outside because the portable hoop violated visual continuity standards. Fear had made everyone think they were alone, and once they saw the pattern, fear started turning into anger. Marlene noticed. She called an emergency board meeting to address what she described as coordinated harassment of volunteer leadership, then proposed a $500 penalty for abusive records requests and actions that disrupted community harmony. The meeting notice went out on a Thursday afternoon for 9 o'clock Friday morning, when most working families could not attend. Claire read the notice and said, "Community harmony sounds a lot like everybody shut up." I said, "That is usually what harmony means when one person owns the microphone." I began visiting neighbors in person, not to pressure anyone, but to explain what the records showed and what Marlene was trying to do. Some people would not open the door. Others glanced down the street before letting me inside, as if Sentinel might arrest them for discussing mulch invoices. Mrs. Alder invited me into her kitchen, where a lemon cake sat cooling beside a stack of violation notices. Her hands trembled as she showed me a letter threatening foreclosure if her fines reached a certain amount. "I have lived here since the first road was paved," she said. "My husband died in that bedroom. My grandchildren learned to walk in this house. And now some woman with a clipboard says my flowers could cost me everything." I wanted to tell her it would all be fine, but promises without a plan are just another form of dishonesty. So I told her the truth. "I cannot guarantee this will be easy, but I can guarantee you will not fight it alone." That evening, 31 households signed a petition demanding a special election under a removal clause buried in the association bylaws. We needed 25% of the homeowners, and we were close enough to make Marlene nervous. That was when Sentinel stopped pretending to be security. The black SUVs began circling at night, slow enough that we could hear gravel crack beneath their tires. Guards shined lights through garage windows, photographed license plates, and followed anyone who attended our meetings. One night my cameras captured a man stepping onto our porch, lifting the lid of our mailbox, and reaching inside before another guard hissed at him to stop. I freeze-framed the video and recognized the first man as Troy Bannon, a former county deputy who had been fired after multiple excessive force complaints. He wore a badge, carried a handgun, and operated as though the neighborhood belonged to him. I checked the state licensing database and discovered Sentinel Neighborhood Services did not have a valid license for armed private patrols. Their insurance had lapsed 4 months earlier, and 3 of their employees had no required firearm certification. They were not law enforcement. They were armed men in matching vests being paid with our dues to frighten families. The next morning, I walked into the police station with a folder thick enough to qualify as home insulation and asked to speak with a detective. Elena Brooks met me in a small interview room, listened without interrupting, then reviewed the footage frame by frame. She had sharp eyes, a calm voice, and the patience of someone who had learned that angry citizens sometimes bring rumors, but frightened citizens sometimes bring evidence. After 20 minutes, she looked up and said, "Mr. Mercer, following minors, attempting to access mail, armed patrol without proper credentials. These are not HOA issues. That is what I've been trying to explain." "No," she said, tapping the folder. "You have been explaining it correctly. The question is how far this goes." She opened an investigation and warned me not to confront the guards directly. I promised I would not. Although some promises require more discipline than others, Marlene responded by filing a police complaint accusing me of threatening board members and organizing dangerous unrest. She claimed my military background made me unpredictable, which was an interesting argument from someone paying armed men to photograph a teenage girl. Detective Brooks reviewed her complaint, then called me and said she provided no evidence of threats, but she did provide a very useful written statement confirming Sentinel works under her direction. That was Marlene's first serious mistake, putting the command structure on paper. Her second came 2 days later, when a law firm delivered a lawsuit demanding $18,000 for accumulated violations, reputational harm, and interference with association business, along with a request to place a lien against our home. Hannah found the envelope on the counter and quietly asked whether we would have to move. I told her no. But later that night I sat alone in the garage with the lawsuit beside me and wondered whether confidence was becoming recklessness. I had spent my career protecting pilots by checking every component twice. Yet now my wife and daughter were taking the pressure from a fight I had chosen to continue. Claire found me staring at nothing, sat on the workbench, and said, "You are doing that thing where you blame yourself for someone else's behavior. They are following you because of me. They're following me because Marlene is afraid of the truth. Those are not the same thing." The next morning, we met attorney Natalie Price, a woman known for dismantling corrupt associations with the cheerful precision of someone opening a stubborn jar. She read the lawsuit, smiled once, and said, "This is intimidation dressed as litigation." Her research uncovered that Cedar Hollow's original developer had gone bankrupt before transferring control properly, and the current board had never been formally ratified by the homeowners. Even better, Marlene's real estate license had expired 9 months earlier, yet she had continued listing properties and collecting commissions inside the community. Natalie filed a motion to dismiss, a counterclaim for harassment and abusive process, and complaints with the state licensing board. Then a judge ordered the HOA to produce the financial records Marlene had been hiding. A forensic accountant named Owen Pike set up in my garage, covering my workbenches with bank statements and ledgers. 3 days later, he placed one sheet of paper in front of us and said, "Your reserve account should contain roughly $450,000. I looked at the balance. It held less than $22,000. Owen turned another page toward me. At least $412,000 was transferred through false emergency expenses and inflated vendor payments. Natalie's expression hardened. "That is not mismanagement. That is embezzlement." Then Owen showed us something that made the room feel suddenly colder. Large transfers to foreign accounts, local assets being liquidated, and inquiries connected to overseas property purchases. Marlene was not planning to defend her empire. She was preparing to disappear. And based on the dates, she knew she had very little time left. That left us with one problem: exposing Marlene without causing the entire neighborhood to panic and dump their homes before we could recover the money. Natalie warned that if word spread carelessly, property values could collapse overnight, lenders might tighten financing, and families already stretched thin could be pushed into foreclosure by fear alone. We needed to show everyone the truth and the path out of it at the same time, which is harder than it sounds when the truth involves $412,000 missing dollars and a woman shopping for houses overseas. I spent 2 nights studying our bylaws, parliamentary rules, and every procedure Marlene might use to shut down a special meeting. Then I made a call I had not expected to make when this started. The people I contacted were members of the Steel Ravens, a veterans motorcycle group I had ridden with after retirement. 26 men and women who had served in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. People who understood the difference between intimidation and protection. Their chapter captain was Malcolm Reed, a retired Army Ranger everyone called Bear, partly because he was 6'5", and partly because he could stand completely still while making a dishonest person reconsider every decision that had brought them into the room. I told him what Sentinel had done to Claire and Hannah, what Marlene had stolen, and why we needed witnesses at the meeting. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You need muscle?" "No," I told him. "I need calm people who do not scare easily," Bear said. "That is what real muscle is." By the following afternoon, the Steel Ravens had organized escorts for elderly residents, transportation for families without cars, and a rotating watch near homes being targeted by Sentinel. Nobody carried weapons into the neighborhood. Nobody threatened anyone, and nobody blocked public roads. They simply appeared, visible and disciplined, and the black SUVs suddenly stopped lingering as long as they used to. Marlene responded the way frightened people with too much power often do. She became reckless. She filed complaints with the fire marshal, claimed our meeting would exceed building capacity, accused Natalie of professional misconduct, and sent letters warning homeowners that supporting me could destroy their property values. Then, she came to my garage herself. Her Mercedes stopped at the end of my driveway just before sunset, and she walked in wearing a beige coat, carrying a leather folder, her heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown. "Grant, this has gone far enough," she said. "I agree. Then we could settle this privately." She offered to erase every fine against our property, reimburse my legal costs, and guarantee that Sentinel would stop monitoring my family if I withdrew the records complaint and canceled the meeting. I stared at her for a second, almost impressed by the arrogance. "You are offering to stop punishing my family if I stop asking where the stolen money went." Her expression hardened. Words like stolen have consequences. So do bank transfers. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Your garage could be reclassified as a commercial use. Your insurance could be reviewed. Your wife works for a hospital that values discretion. Your daughter is applying to colleges, and reputations follow families." There it was, plain and ugly. No polished board language left to hide behind. I pointed toward the camera above the workbench. "You may want to repeat that a little louder. The microphone is excellent." For the first time since I had met her, Marlene looked genuinely afraid. She turned and walked out without another word, and I sent the recording to Natalie before the Mercedes reached the corner. The special meeting took place 3 nights later at the Cedar Hollow Recreation Hall. By 6:30, the parking lot was full. More than 200 residents filling the building while 26 motorcycles stood in a clean line near the curb. The Steel Ravens were not there to create a scene, but their presence told every frightened homeowner that leaving the house that night would not make them a target standing alone. Marlene arrived late with 2 attorneys, Dean, and a dozen unfamiliar people claiming to be concerned residents. Bear's group had already checked the public property list, and not one of those people owned a home in Cedar Hollow. Marlene tried to take control immediately, demanding proof of residency, objecting to recording devices, and declaring the meeting unauthorized. Natalie stood before she could finish. The petition satisfies Section 9 of the governing documents. Notice was properly issued. And because the subject concerns financial contracts involving your family, you are required to recuse yourself. Marlene laughed, but it sounded thin. "I am the elected president. That is one of the questions being decided tonight." I walked to the projector with my hands shaking more than I wanted anyone to see. I had faced emergency landings and aircraft fires without feeling what I felt in that room, because back then I knew my job. That night, I was asking neighbors to trust me with their homes. I put the first bank statement on the screen and said, "Our reserve fund should contain $450,000. It contains less than $22,000. The room went silent. Then came the invoices, the duplicate charges, the fake emergency repairs, the foreign transfers, and the side-by-side photographs of cheap garden center flowers billed as premium installations. I explained that roof inspections showed major replacement work would be needed within 18 months, and without recovery, each household could face an assessment between $17,000 and $23,000. Marlene stood and shouted, "These are accounting discrepancies presented by an unstable man with a grudge." Mrs. Alder rose slowly from the second row, holding her foreclosure warning in one hand. "I have balanced the household budget longer than you have been alive," she said. "A discrepancy is forgetting to carry a number. This is theft." The applause started quietly, then spread across the room. Marlene signaled a stranger she had brought, and they began shouting about militant outsiders and dangerous veterans. Bear stood, removed his cap, and said, "Every person wearing our patch served this country. We are here because unlicensed guards photographed children and followed nurses to work. If protecting frightened families makes us dangerous, you may want to reconsider who the danger is." The hired voices died quickly when Detective Elena Brooks stepped forward from the back wall. She announced that Sentinel was under criminal investigation, that evidence of armed unlicensed patrols had been verified, and that financial records had been referred for state and federal review. Marlene's face went white. The vote followed minutes later. 179 homeowners voted to remove the board, freeze all Sterling-related contracts, and appoint an independent management company. 6 voted against it, including Marlene, Dean, and several people who were escorted out after failing to prove residency. Marlene attempted to leave before the result was certified, but investigators were waiting beside her Mercedes with warrants connected to fraud, intimidation, and obstruction. The black SUVs that had once circled my house disappeared before sunrise. 6 months later, authorities had recovered more than $330,000 through frozen accounts, insurance claims, and asset seizures. Marlene faced federal charges. Dean lost his contracts, and Sentinel was shut down. Cedar Hollow still had to cover part of the reserve shortage, but instead of a $20,000 disaster, families paid manageable installments over several years, with hardship protection for seniors. Mrs. Alder kept her house and every uneven lavender bush in front of it. My garage went back to smelling like coffee, oil, and badly maintained lawn equipment. Only now neighbors came there to solve problems together before they became wars. I used to think courage meant standing alone when everyone else backed away. Cedar Hollow taught me something different. Real courage is being the first person to speak, then making room for others to stand beside you. So tell me honestly, if your HOA doubled the fees, refused to show the books, and sent armed security after your family, would you keep paying for peace, or would you risk everything to expose the truth? Share your state and your own HOA story in the comments, and send this to someone who needs to remember that intimidation only works while good people believe they are alone.